So as some of you may have seen, I've been ranting about the flight performance of the Harrier. I made a bug report, and it was passed to the developers only to have the most inaccurate and half-baked reply you could imagine. So I've decided to try explain definitively and exactly what all of the information I have gathered means, and how it needs to be in the game. To save time, I have unfortunately used text-to-speech, so bear with me. We will start with the developer's reply. The few major issues with their testing are as follows. 1. The throttle settings they used are incorrect. 2. The weight they used is nearly 1,000 kilos too little. 3. And they compared it to an aircraft weighing near 3,000 pounds, more than any of the aircraft mentioned in my reports, and at an altitude 5,000 feet above any of the tests I claimed. All of this information can be seen above, with them stating 100% throttle in-game being mapped as 19,000 pounds thrust, then max thrust, and then military. Addressing the weight, the developers used 50% fuel capacity to test sustained turn rate. In my source, the aircraft has a specified starting fuel weight of 4,400 pounds, or about 85%. This can be read on Part 16. The Harrier 1 has a maximum fuel weight of around 5,000 pounds. If they used 50%, that gives a weight of 2,500 pounds, a whole 1,900 pounds, less than what was actually used. With the thrust setting normal lift being used to sustain 13 degrees a second in my document, the RPM percentage would need to be 100.5. In my document, the Pegasus Mk.103 was used, and I have provided the engine setting chart above. We can see that the absolute max thrust setting is using 107% RPM. The max RPM of the Harrier GR3 in-game is 7,510. With this value, we can determine RPM for every 1% throttle in-game by dividing 7,510 by 107. This gives you 70.186 RPM for every 1% rating used in the engine chart. By multiplying 70.1869 with the 100.5% RPM needed to reach normal lift rating, you will get 7,053.8 RPM. With 81% throttle in-game on the Harrier GR3, you get 7,057 RPM, almost exactly this normal lift RPM setting, not 100% throttle as claimed by the developers. I did a quick test flight in simulator starting with 90% fuel capacity, so when I started my sustained turn tests, the aircraft would have as close as possible to the 85% that was used in the document as fuel gets burned on takeoff and gaining speed to 0.7 Mach, as this is the Harrier's max sustained turn rate speed. The first test I did was at 98% throttle, as that is the actual mapping of 19,500 pounds thrust for the Mark 103 engine in-game to further prove the lack of performance. Here I throttle back to around 81% throttle. As we previously calculated, this should be the actual normal lift setting based off of the flight reference card for the Harrier GR3. When I reach a stable speed of 0.7 Mach, I can only sustain around 10 degrees a second on average with the 81% throttle, with the 100% throttle only sustaining 11.5 on average. Let's also take note of the fuel weight being almost 2,000 kilos midway through my test, as this would be dead on with the 4,400 pounds used in the document. I have three main sources, one from NASA, one from the Royal Aircraft Establishment. The last is from the Central Tactics and Trials Organization. All three sources have aircraft weights that are around 500 kilos apart and start at 13 degrees a second and go to 15 degrees a second sustained turn rate. They go 13, 14, 15, each with an aircraft weight being around 500 kg less than the first. This makes perfect sense, as an aircraft can sustain harder turns with less weight. Yet the developers seem to believe that the aircraft is not capable of this despite having been provided with three linked sources. They even incorrectly labeled my NASA chart as 5-18, as that is the max load test, when in reality it clearly lists 5-19 above the chart I provided. It says extremely simply that the graph 5-19 shows the aircraft's turning performance as a function of Mach number and altitude before buffet onset, meaning low induced drag. The value reached was 14 degrees a second at 0.7 Mach at sea level. The final test was this accelerometer reading done at 0.7 Mach with 0 flap setting. The numbers going up are G achieved in a flat turn, and the numbers going across are acceleration g in the plane's axis, as in accelerating or decelerating in airspeed. If a plane has 0 acceleration and 0 deceleration, it is maintaining speed. If you follow the 0 line up, it meets at very near 6.5 g. Unfortunately, the last test doesn't say turn rate. However, this is easy to calculate. The Harrier AV-8A flight manual has a turn capability chart for us to use. The accelerometer test was done at 0.7 Mach at sea level. By converting Mach to knots, we get 466. So at 466 knots, the Harrier GR3 used in the test was sustaining 6.5 g. If you find 466 knots on the left of the chart and trace a straight line to where 6.5 g would be, you will get around 15 degrees a second turn rate. This last test was conducted with an aircraft weight of 15,500 pounds, or 7,030 kilos. This can be seen on a section of the test parameter pages. We can see here that the NASA test was at 7,584 kilos, exactly 554 kilos heavier than the accelerometer test. Next, I have a section from a book, The Great Book of Modern Warplanes. It was written by a few well-respected authors, including the likes of Mike Spick and Bill Gunston. In this section, we can see an operational weight of the GR3 being 12,640 pounds. If we add the 4,400 pounds of fuel from the first report, we are at 17,040 pounds, or 7,729 kilos. This does not include the two 30mm Aden gun pods with their ammunition, however. Nor does it include the pilot. When the pilot and cannons are added to the weight, there will likely be enough weight for it to be close to 500 kilos, more than the NASA test. To summarize this long slideshow, the Harrier at 8,000-odd kg will sustain 13 degrees a second, as listed in the Air Combat Trials report, meaning it is safe to say the Harrier sustaining 14 degrees a second at 7,584 kilos is 100% possible. And lastly, 15 degrees a second at 7,030 kilograms is equally as possible. Hope that clarified exactly how all of my data and performance values were calculated, as well as answering any questions. If anyone has any further information or questions, feel free to comment them down below.